biography on the chairs, as you do for all the speakers, so I'm not going to spend as much time as it would take to do justice to Wendy's CV, but we have worked together a long time. Just before the Executive Director of KIND, she was Chief Counsel on the immigration policy in the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Immigration, working with the late Senator Edward Kennedy. So Wendy is going to give us an overview of the issues that present themselves when unaccompanied minors are apprehended, either as they cross the border, at the border, or in the interior of the country. Then we're going to have a presentation from Jessica Jones, who is at the Women's Refugee Commission and is an Equal Justice Works Fellow, sponsored by the law firm of Steptoe and Johnson. And Jessica works with the Detention and Asylum Program at the Women's Refugee Commission. And she has been instrumental in a report that will be coming out shortly, and which you'll get a preview of today, which has actually interviewed people who work with children at the border, perhaps more importantly, interviewed the children themselves about the reasons for that they left their countries, the circumstances in which they've come to the United States, and the conditions in which they're being held in detention, and many other details. I've had the chance to have a quick preview of the report myself, and it's absolutely fascinating and quite distressing. We're going to wrap up the presentations with comments from Michelle Brané, the Director of the Detention and Asylum Program at the Women's Refugee Commission. And as I said before, the Women's Commission has done really terrific work on this issue. And Michelle is going to focus us on the policy issues that arise from the situation and from the Women's Commission report. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Wendy Young, the Executive Director of KIND.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thanks for organizing the presentation, and I'm very pleased to be here with the Women's Commission. I'm going to start by sharing a story with you, and this is a story that I share frequently because despite the fact that I've been working on this issue since 1989, this child's face sticks with me whenever I think about the work that we do. About a year ago, I had the privilege of sitting in on the juvenile docket in the Baltimore Immigration Court, and these are days that are dedicated to children's cases. They tend to be quite chaotic. There's kids of all ages in the courtroom with family members. It gets noisy and lively. But in walked that day a little girl about this tall, and she was a 5-year-old girl from Mexico. Her hair was in pigtails. She was wearing her Sunday best. It was a little red dress. She had these little Ugg boots on, and she was clutching a doll. And she came to the respondent's table. She was with another young woman who looked maybe to be 18 or 19 herself, and the relationship to the little girl wasn't quite clear to me. But the little girl came to the respondent's table, a table very much like this, in this very formal courtroom setting, and she sits down behind the microphone, and the microphone's up here. And she sits there with her baby doll. And the immigration judge, Judge Gossard, proceeded to ask her questions. And she had very little to add to this hearing at 5 years old. She had no lawyer with her at this proceeding. So it went on, and the judge tried to ask her questions about how her life was going. And finally, he granted a continuance. He said, "We're going to let you come back. You know, I suggest that you try to find a lawyer." And KIND is in the back of the room. Talk to them, and they'll do what they can to find you a free volunteer pro bono attorney. And the little girl gets up. She's leaving the courtroom. The judge says to her, "So what's your baby doll's name?" And she looked at him and she said in Spanish, baby doll." And that was the end of the hearing. Fast forwarding many months later, we were able to get her a pro bono attorney, and she was granted special immigrant juvenile status. But when I asked our staff attorney, our pro bono coordinator, how did it go in terms of trying to do an intake with this child to find out what was going on in her life? And she said, well, it took a lot of Play-Doh and a lot of candy. But KIND was founded in 2008 to exactly address this legal services gap for unaccompanied children. We were co-founded by Microsoft and Angelina Jolie because under our current immigration laws, individuals have the privilege of counsel, but at no expense to the government when they are in immigration proceedings. And for children, these are very, as I said, very formal proceedings, very complicated proceedings. Our laws are complicated. These are kids to begin with, and they are kids who are often very traumatized by their journey to the United States. So without the assistance of counsel, they are very unlikely to be able to navigate that system and access. In fact, kids who are represented by counsel are 3 times more likely to obtain some form of protection in the United States and the ability to remain here. Historically, about 8,000 unaccompanied children arrive in the United States each year. Now, the number is somewhat misleading in that there are kids who make it across the border and are never apprehended. There are also kids who make it to the border and then are turned away, and I think the Women's Commission will probably be addressing that in a few minutes. So when we talk about the 8,000, what we're talking about is 8,000 kids who are, this is legally not the correct, placed into the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement within the Department of Health and Human Services. Looking back historically, this was actually an issue that's been going on for years, not quite at the same level of numbers, but every year unaccompanied kids have come into the United States, and historically, if you look back, what happened really was one thing that drew attention to this issue and the needs of these children. It was the arrival of Elian Gonzalez. Not a case that people normally think about when they think about unaccompanied children because it took so many bizarre twists and turns. But that really was the issue that elevated the needs of unaccompanied children in the public's attention. And having worked on that case at the time when I was with the Women's Commission, we ended up doing a lot of advocacy around, well, Elian's situation is a little peculiar, and there are thousands of other children who arrive who don't get that level of attention but have tremendous needs. Over time, we were able to make reforms to the system. There was a lawsuit that was settled, Flores, that established standards for the care, custody, and placement of children. There was a provision in the Homeland Security Act of 2002 which transferred custody of children away from the legacy Immigration Naturalization Service when it was absorbed by DHS. This program was the only program broken away and given to a new agency, which was the Department of Health and Human Services and ORR. And then ultimately, at the time, there was a very comprehensive piece of legislation called the Unaccompanied Alien Child Protection Act. Piece by piece, that was absorbed into the law, primarily through the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. I was on a panel the other day in New York with Judge Videla of New York, who's an immigration judge who oversees the juvenile dockets there, and he said something that I thought was very important. That, sometimes we have to remind ourselves on this issue, it's glass half full. And what I mean by that is there have been, over time, changes made to the system so that it has become more child-oriented and more child-friendly. That includes, for example, the implementation of juvenile dockets in the immigration courts. It includes the transfer of children to ORR custody, where there's a break between the law enforcement concerns around these children and the care, custody, and placement functions. I have to say that right now we're at a very, very pivotal moment. Since the start of this fiscal year in October 2011, we have seen a huge jump in the number of unaccompanied children arriving. As of 3 weeks ago, ORR reported that they had in custody over 10,000 children, which is more than their normal annual total, and we're on track for, I understand, roughly 14,000 to 15,000 kids this year. This has put enormous pressures on the system. Because ORR had maintained bed space for these children at a level kind of assuming that static flow of about 8,000 a year, and all of a sudden you see this huge increase. Where are you going to find those bed spaces? So the initial response appropriately was find a place to house these kids while we figure out what to do. And slowly ORR has moved towards identifying licensed bed space for these kids so that it's an appropriate system. But basically what we're seeing is twice as many kids being moved through the system, released at twice the rate. What I mean by that is the normal length of stay in custody used to be somewhere around 72 days and now is down around 42 or 44 days, so almost a halving in that. And then on top of that, more kids are actually being deemed eligible for release, somewhere up around 80 or 90%. So you see a lot of kids moving through this system very, very rapidly. Prior to the influx in kind caseload, about 85% of the children we worked with were from Central America, with Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras being the top sending countries. Mexico is number 4. But we currently work with kids of 59 nationalities. The average age was about 14 and a half, our youngest child 2 years old, and about 75% of the kids we work with are boys. Those statistics may also start to change as we unpack this recent influx. My understanding is that it is still largely Central American children, with the spikes most noticeable among Guatemalan and Salvadoran children. But there seems to be a higher mix of girls in the population, and there seems to be a higher percentage of kids under age 14. So we may see a lowering in that age. And all of that has repercussions. Why are these kids coming? Well, generally, I think it's a red flag whenever a child arrives alone in the United States. I mean, if you think about it, it's not normal for a child to not be living with their family, to not be living in their community. And it's extraordinary for a child to be crossing international borders by themselves. Kids are fleeing human rights abuses, they're fleeing armed conflict, they're fleeing natural disasters, they're fleeing child abuse at home, they're fleeing gang recruitment in Central America, and we'll get back to that in a second, food insecurity, economic deprivation, and a lot of kids are traveling to reunite with family who are already here. That may be parents or it may not. It may be an aunt, an uncle, an older sibling, a cousin, but they may have somebody here. The voyage itself is something we often overlook when we talk about these kids, but the trip is very, very dangerous. These kids are smuggled, they're trafficked, they're walking, they're jumping trains, they're stowaways on boats. Basically, they will get here any way that they can, and there are very high levels of smuggling and trafficking. And sometimes people, I think, forget that smuggling can be also very dangerous for children. The smugglers can become very abusive. We do see, for example, with girls, very high levels of sexual violence. Many of the girls we work with are pregnant by virtue of rape. We see kids who've been robbed, beaten, harassed as they make their way north to the United States. One thing I do want to point out, when we talk about the numbers having doubled, and those of us who are with us from the government, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this. I understand that the number of kids that are actually being seen at the border isn't necessarily going up as much as the number of kids being admitted into ORR custody, and that could be because of the change in the populations. Mexican kids are generally turned away at the border, whereas the Central American and other kids are admitted and placed into ORR custody. The kids, once they're apprehended, as I said, they're issued a notice to appear, which is basically the initiation of their deportation proceedings. It's the charging document. So they're required to appear in immigration court. Now they can, while in court, they can raise a defense to their deportation. And kids generally may be eligible for the same forms of relief that we see adults are eligible for. They may be eligible for asylum because they have a well-founded fear of persecution, T visa because they've been trafficked, a U visa because they're a victim of a serious crime. And then there's one program that we see increasingly, which is kids who are eligible for what's known as the Special Immigrant Juvenile Program. This is a program that was designed to protect kids who are found by a U.S. family court to have been abused, abandoned, or neglected, and cannot reunify with one or both parents. Once a family court makes that finding, which is what we call the predicate order, then the child can apply for a visa with Citizenship and Immigration Services, which leads to permanent residence. As I said, kids who are represented by counsel are 3 times more likely to obtain relief from deportation. While the kids are in custody, there is a network of service providers who work with those children to provide Know Your Rights presentations, to do individual screenings of the children, and then to refer the children for services post-release, legal services post-release. This is where KIND kicks in. We primarily work with kids once they're released from custody. But I have to say, with the number of kids going through the system currently, I'm very concerned about 2 things. One is that the detained service providers will have a very limited window of time to work with these kids to ensure that they do have access to the kind of legal information that they need in order to prepare themselves for their proceedings once they're released. And then secondly, we already, Kind, has seen a spike in the number of case referrals we're receiving of 57%. Honestly, my office is being flooded. And this is even under very rigorous case selection criteria, because even pre-influx, we were not at a point where we could meet the needs of all the children who came to us, even though we're really grounded on the vision of no child should appear in immigration court alone. We weren't there yet. But with a 57% spike in referrals, we are really inundated at this point, and I'm very concerned about what we do to address that. This is also somewhat ironic in that we had just completed an assessment. We hired a consulting firm. This is very, Microsoft is one of my bosses, and they're very corporate in their approach to things, which I appreciate. And they wanted to, basically what they said to me is, okay, we've been with you for 3 years. I want to see what kind of results you're getting. So the assessment revealed, and it was based on an extensive, basically, data analysis where EOR and ORR provided us data, which we very much appreciated, as well as our own data. And it showed that the rate of representation for children post-release, since Kind had come into play, had increased from 27% to 51%. So we were all ready to give ourselves a nice pat on the back. So much for that. As my board co-chair said, the goalpost just moved twice as far down the field. So now we're trying to figure out how we're going to do the Hail Mary and get across the finish line. I will say to end, thinking of Judge Vidala's comment again on a positive note, Kind has received an incredible response from the private sector on this issue. We're partnering with 125 major law firms and corporate legal departments, 20 law schools. We've trained 4,200 volunteer lawyers to work with these kids. And what is really encouraging to me is we now have firms and lawyers coming back to us and saying, you know what, we like that. We want to do more of that. So there is capacity out there, but we also need the support of our infrastructure to ensure that those attorneys not only take a case, but that they're given the kind of training and mentoring it requires to ensure that the child receives high-quality representation. Because the lawyers we work with, they're real estate lawyers, they're corporate lawyers, they're tax lawyers, they're pretty much anything but an immigration lawyer. And immigration law is very, very complicated. So I'm just going to end on a couple of recommendations. One is feeling very positive about the fact that we are actually, in fact, seeing kids head in the direction that we've been advocating for a long time, which is to be held for the shortest time possible in federal custody and in the least restrictive setting. ORR has really taken this program from a very kind of secure facility model to more of a group shelter model, and hopefully more toward other settings such as small group homes and foster care. But we also need to ensure that the child's best interests and well-being are addressed as they're released from federal custody. Second, we feel very strongly that we need to start clustering services post-release. If we can't get to these children, if you will, while they're in custody because they're being moved through the system rapidly, the next point of contact really is their first master calendar hearing, their first appearance in immigration court. So we have been discussing with EOR the need to cluster services at that point. And by that I mean have a legal service provider at the courtroom to say to the child, it's really important you get a lawyer. It's really important that you be represented through these proceedings. Have what's called the child advocate program there, which is roughly the equivalent of a guardian ad litem program in the system. Be able to hook children who are vulnerable up with that kind of support. There's a program called LOPC, or Legal Orientation Program for Custodians. This is a briefing that the children's families go through so that they understand their responsibilities in the system. Have LOPC there. And then also post-release social services such as the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops provides. And I know Natalie, where's Natalie? She's somewhere. There's Natalie right there in front of me. She may be speaking to that in a second. So capture these kids, if you will, at the next moment where we know they're going to appear. This is very important, not only because it's supporting the child in the way they need to be supported, but also kids who are given these kind of support systems are much, much more likely to appear for their proceedings rather than to just disappear and not appear and be ordered removed in absentia or possibly appear in court pro se. And then finally, the last recommendation I'd like to make is I think that we need to take a regional approach to this issue. And I know there are representatives here from some of the look at what happens to these kids from the root causes of why they left to begin with, what's happening during their journey here, what happens to them in the United States, and then what happens to them afterwards, whether they're given relief in the United States or they voluntarily go home or are ordered deported. Just as a final footnote, KIND is piloting a project in Guatemala to help kids who are returning to their home country. And basically what we're doing is partnering with local Guatemalan NGOs to welcome the child at the airport, to make sure the child has a family member there to welcome them, to facilitate their travel back to the home community, and then to offer them whatever they need, education, scholarship service, health care, job skills training, so that they really have a true opportunity to remain home in a way that's and ensures their well-being. The success of that project has been phenomenal from one perspective alone, which is of the kids who have participated, we've only had 4 who've then turned around and tried to re-migrate to the United States, which is a much, much lower rate than you normally see. So I threw a lot out there, and I'm going to stop.
Great. That is a lot.
General question. Is a minor under 16 or under 18?
Thank you. 18.
Under 18.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for that really sort of comprehensive picture, Wendy. We're now going to get much more granular, and we'll turn to Jessica Jones of the Women's Commission for that.
Thank you, Kathleen, for the opportunity to share some of our findings from our recent fact-finding trip to the border. I thought I would start by giving you a little background to why the Women's Refugee Commission made a fact-finding trip to the border. As Wendy mentioned, this fiscal year has seen an unprecedented numbers of unaccompanied migrant youth who entered into ORR's custody. And this started with fiscal year 2012 in October, and by April, ORR actually started seeing about double the amount of youth that would normally come over on a monthly basis. And what happened, actually, as a result of this happening, no one actually knew why this new trend started happening, and people started actually treating it as it was an anomaly. In response, ORR had to try and accommodate this increase in the number of children by setting up surge facilities in Texas. And these surge facilities were intended to house children for very short stays until they could get transferred into regular ORR facilities. As a result of this unexpected influx of children, DCS staff also had to work around the clock to try to open these surge facilities and to manage the placements.
Jessica, just familiar with the acronyms. DCS is Department of Children's Services.
Yeah, the Department of Children's Services, yes, within ORR. And these surge facilities were emergency housing facilities, and ORR used YMCAs, they used gymnasiums at already ORR facilities, and they also used the Lackland Air Force Base, which got a lot of press, to get those children out of the CBP holding cells and to provide for their care. At the Women's Refugee Commission, we started getting inundated by calls by other immigration advocates and by media. In response, we decided to actually make this fact-finding trip to actually look into why the children were coming, what were the children saying for the reasons for why they were coming, and to also look at some concerns that were raised by other advocates about conditions in their treatment in CBP and at ORR. So in early June, Jennifer Podkol and I went to the border, and with a primary goal to look into why so many more Central American youth were actually coming to the U.S. In particular, there was more children, as Wendy mentioned, from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And both DCS and Border Patrol actually documented a significant increase from the countries of Guatemala and Honduras. We had 2 primary goals when we went down to the border. One, to actually talk to the children to ask them why they were coming, and then 2, to actually look at the policies and identify gaps and provide solutions to improve the care and custody of these children. We conducted focus group interviews with over 150 youth from 7 different ORR placements in Harlingen and San Antonio. We met with government agencies tasked with responding to the influx of children. This includes CBP, ICE, ORR, and EOR. We also interviewed staff from ORR facilities, as well as non-governmental legal service providers and other post-release social service providers. And our report, titled Forced from Home, The Lost Boys and Girls of Central America, will actually be coming out in August with all of our research and our recommendations. So why the influx? The youth we interviewed in ORR custody described increasingly horrible conditions in the countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Over 77% of our participants we interviewed stated a sharp increase in violence, in particular gang violence, was the main reason more youth were fleeing their countries. Most of them expressed a necessity for leaving their home, indicating more of a push and not a pull factor for their decisions to migrate. As one of the youth that we interviewed stated, in El Salvador, there is a wrong. It's being young. You're stalked by gangs, authorities beat and follow kids because they don't trust them. They think they're gang members. There are no jobs for young people because employers don't trust the kids either. It is better to be old. And this comment actually really expresses the sentiment of the youth that we interviewed, who really articulated that they felt a need to leave and that it was no longer safe in their countries to stay there because of their status as being a young person. And these conditions reflect several familiar trends in Central America that have worsened significantly over the past decade, including rising crime, systemic corruption, and entrenched economic inequality. And these issues have created a climate in which children constantly fear for their lives, so much so that they are willing to risk the uncertain dangers of the trip north to escape the certain dangers they face at home. We heard children repeat the phrase, "I knew I may die on the journey, but I also knew I definitely would die if I stayed home." Our research we conducted refuted some reasons why people speculated for the increase. For example, that a change in the Mexican migration law had an effect on the release of unaccompanied youth from immigration detention in Mexico, and therefore allowed them to make their way to the U.S. In fact, the new Mexican migration law's purpose was actually to increase the protection by transferring unaccompanied minors from immigration detention into the child welfare entity of DEEF, a similar system that we have here in the U.S. Additionally, the law provided for an opportunity to apply for a humanitarian transit visa. Many of these provisions in the law, including the transit visa, are awaiting regulations before going into effect. And the Mexican detention of unaccompanied minors has also increased and has doubled during the same period that ORR's numbers were doubling. Our conclusion is that until the conditions for youth in these countries change substantially, we expect this new trend will become the new norm. In addition to why we asked youth for the reason for why they were coming, we also interviewed them about their experience in custody, both with CBP, ICE, and with ORR. Over 80 of the 150 participants we interviewed were either in surge placements or had previously been in surge.
Jessica, could you?
In those kinds of detention, CBP, ICE, and...
Yeah, sure. So in CBP, there's two parts of CBP. There's OFO and then Border Patrol. And
OFO's Office of Field Operations.
Sorry, I speak in lingo.
Give us a
So within CBP, they have these short-term holding cells along the border where typically the children are supposed to stay there for a period not longer than 72 hours. And then they're transferred over to ORR if they're children actually from non-contiguous countries. Otherwise, children from contiguous countries, there are MOU agreements with Mexico and Canada to repatriate those children, unless they've been screened for trafficking or for asylum, which isn't being done, which we can talk about later. That's another whole issue. And then after they're transferred, they go into ORR's custody, and ORR places them in their whole spectrum of placements, which includes shelter care, secure detention facilities, and then their foster care placements, which are foster homes and group homes. And then in response to this surge, ORR did start building these emergency surge facilities, which were the contracts with the YMCAs, and then using the gyms, transforming the gyms into these sort of short-term emergency shelters. So they had them, for the most part, along the border, primarily in Texas. And I know ORR is here, so if you have more questions about that, you can definitely ask that too. So when we were there in June, actually ORR started in the process of transitioning and closing those surge facilities because they were able to open new licensed care facilities. But we did have the opportunity to interview the children that had been previously in surge. So over 80 of the 150 participants we interviewed had been either in Lackland or they were in one of these sort of these gymnasium surge facilities. So the youth reported overcrowding at the CBP holding cells. Instead of staying there for up to 72 hours, they stayed there for up to 2 weeks. They also reported physical and verbal abuse by Border Patrol agents. Youth in surge facilities also reported not having the Know Your Rights presentations or legal screenings. And there was just a general disorientation of not knowing why they were there and when they could call their families. And this in turn caused them really significant psychological distress. Youth also revealed other conditions concerns that indicated some oversight gaps by ORR. And many of these concerns, however, could have been prevented if ORR was provided with the adequate resources and the staff to respond to the supervisory need. From our observations and conversations with government officials, it was clear that both ORR and CBP and ICE were overstretched and struggled to manage the placement and transportation demands of almost double the amount of youth typically in their custody. Our interviews with service providers revealed significant backlogs in social services mandated under the TVPRA, which resulted in several protection gaps. In addition to these gaps, we also identified some best practices in the Brownsville area in particular, where ORR and CBP formed partnerships to meet the pressing needs of youth in CBP stations who are awaiting placement. This crisis also forced ORR to reevaluate their release procedures to sponsors who care for them for the duration of their immigration case. And ORR streamlined this reunification process with sponsors so that the average length of stay was for about 40 to 50 days, where previously in fiscal year 2011, the average stay was 70 to 80 days. While we think this is a significant improvement, we believe that without the corresponding increase in social services, child advocates, and legal representation post-release, there could also be significant protection gaps, which could affect their immigration appearance rates, as Wendy indicated. And I'll stop here so that Michelle can talk in more detail about our policy reform recommendations.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And so as not to leave us in suspense about your recommendation, we'll go directly to Michelle Brané, who directs the Detention and Asylum Program at the Women's Commission.
Thank you. Following a little along Wendy's initiative of the glass half full, I did want to say that what's been good about this experience, I think, is that there has been an enormous amount of collaboration and effort, not just among the different government agencies involved to address this, but with NGOs as well. So we're moving in the right direction, let me put it that way, because Jessica's account is a little depressing. So I think also what's important is that the ORR has managed to contract for a lot of new beds, which puts us in a very different position, no longer in this crisis mode, and that there are a lot of lessons that have been learned from this experience that I think we can carry forward. I wanted to also start by kind of saying that in working on issues of unaccompanied children in government custody or in immigration proceedings, it's not exactly, I mean, there are a lot of differences from similar situations in the adult context. And, this is just yet another example, I think, of where children are not just little adults, which is often how they get treated in our kind of political systems. And what I'm getting at with that is that, one of the common questions we were getting, as Jessica mentioned, when we were getting flooded with phone calls from immigration advocates was, why aren't they just releasing them? Why are they even holding them? Why do they need more beds? And what seems somewhat obvious to somebody who's working with unaccompanied children on a daily basis and isn't so much to people who aren't is you can't just release a 10-year-old or a 6-year-old or even a 15-year-old to whoever comes to the door or to nothing. It's not that simple. And so it really is a balancing act that ORR and DHS has to manage between reuniting children with family as quickly as possible, finding sponsors for them to kind of move them through the system, but also making sure that they are, that their protection needs are being met and that they're not being released to the wolves, so to speak. And that's tricky. It's a tricky balance. And so I guess I start by just laying that out there and saying that it's a constant push and pull, and it's hard to get it right. So, keep that in mind as we talk about some of the recommendations and solutions we put forward. So, as I mentioned, one of the really good things about having this crisis occur is the response we've seen. The White House has been playing a very large role in bringing agencies together. I think historically, I will just go out and say it, Health and Human Services and Homeland Security have not always had the same vision for what should happen. I mean, they're coming from very different missions. So it's great, I think, that they are really trying hard to work together and resolve some of these issues. What I will add is that I think we really also need to bring EOIR into the picture. We have all, as NGOs, I think, been meeting with the different agencies separately and in some contexts together, but just as Border Patrol, ICE, and Health and Human Services are all seeing more kids, the immigration courts are also seeing more children come into their courts, and that causes also delays in how their cases are processed. So, the emergency modes won't work indefinitely. It's good that the government seems to be really treating this as the new norm, and that we have this high-level interest. I think in addition to kind of addressing and trying to systematize some of the solutions that were created as the influx was happening, it's also a very good opportunity to look at our system overall of how we work with unaccompanied children. And, a lot of the day-to-day issues that come up during the custody of children, we've already outlined actually in a report that we wrote many years ago. And I think outside there's a summary of it, but it's called Halfway Home, and it really lays out how children are placed into custody and kind of different conditions issues. During that, very little has changed since that report, although there have been some improvements, so I don't want to say that everything in there is still an issue, but we already know what a lot of the underlying issues were. Many of those were just exacerbated when you throw twice as many kids into the system. So things like conditions at Border Patrol stations. Border Patrol stations were never meant to house children. And, any Border Patrol officer or field office operations officer you speak to will say, we don't want these kids here. We don't have the resources to deal with them. We're not, child welfare folks. We're law enforcement officers. And then when you throw twice as many in, that's why you have these situations where they sit at stations for longer than anybody really wants them to. But having said that, I think that we learned that there are things that can happen and that can be done regarding conditions and staffing and resources at Border Patrol stations and Office of Field Operations facilities to prevent these sort of things from happening. So basic conditions issues like the temperature, having blankets, having people tasked, staffed to work with the kids and address their direct needs, as opposed to having a law enforcement officer who suddenly has to go get diapers for, a 2-year-old. Having those things integrated into the system from the very beginning, I think would really help prevent something like this from happening in the future. And some of that, as Jessica mentioned, already started to happen with collaborations between ORR and Border Patrol in places like Brownsville, where they really saw this influx and made arrangements to deal with it. Things like that should be normalized. I think, Wendy mentioned some of the other suggestions in terms of clustering legal services and making the system overall more efficient. I think also really we need to think through how children are placed into ORR, Division of Children's Services facilities. And there is already a lot of discussion around this happening. But children tend to get clumped along the border where there really is a lack of appropriate services, and which isn't where, it makes it more difficult to get the children back or reunited with family and sponsors. So looking at where children are trying to go, where there are services available to serve their best interests, and I know that is really essential. And then, getting beds in those places. DHS and ORR are already doing some mapping exercises along these lines, so we encourage that to go forward. They've already also started working groups, interagency working groups, where they talk a lot about these issues, and one of the big issues is screening of children at the border. We've alluded to that several times. The TVPRA requires that children from contiguous countries, and let's be honest, we're talking mostly about Mexico here, get screened for risk of trafficking and for protection concerns. And we have a lot of concerns, and have for a long time, that is not really happening very effectively, so that needs to be revisited. But also, as I said, the working groups are a great step. But in addition to rolling in all of these government agencies, we really need to get NGOs involved in these planning processes. And I think that there is some of that happening, but it really needs to happen at early stages. Because just as HHS is overstretched, so are NGOs, as Wendy mentioned. All of the NGOs who are providing services for these children are also having to do twice as much with the same or fewer resources. And then the other kind of area that I would just say, there's been a lot of work on the administrative level with this. We've also been doing visits to congressional offices. It's no surprise, again, to anybody, this is kind of a difficult time to do things in that realm, both for political reasons, but also because this increase and this strain on resources happened after one round of appropriations had been kind of dealt with, and even if we had been able to get a lot into the appropriations process in terms of attempting to do so, the reality is that these days you're not likely to get much more money to do anything, and in fact, it's more likely you're going to get less. So again, all of us, the government and NGOs, everybody is working to do twice as much with less funding. So it makes it that much more critical that we really try to figure out how to do this most effectively and in a way that really gets at the best of these children, which is ultimately what I think we all want to do. So I'm going to leave it at that so that we have plenty of time for questions, because I'm sure we can.
Great, thank you. I certainly have about a dozen that have occurred to me as you all have been talking, and I know that many of you have those questions as well. Let me just put a couple of things out on the table that I hope we'll get to in the discussion. And a couple of things I'm going to mention are things that I sort of picked up from just glancing through the draft report. One thing that certainly struck me with great force was, even though a minority of the caseload are girls, a very large number, as you said, I think, Wendy, seem to have been subject to sexual violence, and a great many turn up pregnant. Mm-hmm. I mean, dealing with pregnant children in this sort of volume is something that, creates kind of challenges that I don't imagine the Border Patrol, for one, has been very accustomed to dealing with. Second is the question of is the new normal? I mean, are we, the rate of increase has been going up so strongly. Are we likely to see 10, 12,000 cases every year, or is this just the beginning of that upward curve? Is this rate of increase likely to be sustained, and if so, what are the implications of that? I mean, if the system is bursting at the seams already, what can possibly happen if this goes on? I think you just sort of mentioned in passing appropriations, Michelle, but clearly, even to fulfill the most basic humane conditions. I mean, some of the conditions that you described, with children being kept in gyms where there isn't even enough space for them to lie down all at the same time, where they don't have beds, where there's no natural light, where they aren't allowed to go outside, where they lose track of the time because they can't tell the difference between day and night. I mean, this is just not something that we can tolerate happening in this country. And finally, I guess, this occurs to me, with all the agencies doing their very best to get kids out of these conditions, what awaits them on the other end? If you have 90% release rates and there's very much larger number of children coming through, needing to be processed through the courts, needing to have social services, what's happening? What can happen? So, lots of other questions, but those are just some of the ones that occur to me. And I know, as our panelists have mentioned, that we do have lots of experts in the room from some of the countries of origin, from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Natalie Lumert is with us, has been spending time on this. Ken Toda, the Deputy Director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, who has into whose custody these children move. We're very grateful to you for coming, Ken. So I'd like to ask you two if you'd like to add anything to the panel, and then I'll turn to the rest of you for your questions and comments. Natalie, please.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Please
for those
stand
of you,
if you wouldn't mind.
Oh, okay. Now I'm really intimidated. Okay, microphone and standing. My name is Natalie Lumert. I work at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. We've been providing services for unaccompanied children for about 18 years now, both family unification services for the children who are released and joining their families again, and also foster care and other services for the youth who have nowhere to go and who will be with us for the future. Refugees and asylum-seeking children. Some thoughts as I was listening to you all. I think one danger in just starting at the beginning of saying unaccompanied children, is we lose the context that if you think about the life of the child, we're really only, this time period. These kids are going, like you said, Kathleen, 98%, I think you said, were released. They're going to their families, and I think as we're designing a system, as we're looking at legal services, social services, whatever it is, these children for the most part are going to families, and we need to look at how do we plan in that family context. So I would say, in building on what Wendy was saying about post-release and legal services, I think that definitely needs to be coupled with social services, and that's one area that we've been specializing in, and to OR's credit, they've been increasing the post-release services, recognizing that there are issues of post-release. in a nutshell, what the post-release services are doing is supporting the family to be stable, to prevent the child breakdown. You mentioned the child advocate. One glass half full is that in the U.S., if the child does enter the child protective system, there is a child advocacy network there for that. And so the goal, though, of the post-release services is to prevent that family breakdown. And so one thing I would say is that those services need to be community-based. They need to couple the expertise of family preservation and immigrant and refugee services to make sure that child has a right to go to school, because schools in the U.S. still are preventing undocumented children from going to school, and the families don't know it, and they need to have some caseworker, social worker to help them, and to be that in-between to make sure that the child goes to school. I have lots of thoughts, but let me wrap up. I think that we need to look at also at transnationally. Might be radical. This is a little controversial to say, but just because a child is eligible for SIJ doesn't mean it's in that child's best interest. We need to be doing special immigrant juvenile status. I think we need to be looking at doing some type of international home studies. What's difficult is that it's nobody's real responsibility or authority to do it. But if we really are interested in looking at children in the family context, we can't lose sight of the families back home and if they're able to reunite with their family and what really is in the best interest of the child. And then regarding the kids at the border, we talk a lot over the years and we advocated a lot about separating humanitarian and child welfare from law enforcement. It's time to bring that to the border too, and bring the humanitarian assistance to the border and separate that from the law enforcement at the border.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Ken, did you want to add anything as well? I don't want to put you guys on the spot, but we do want to take advantage of your presence here. Yeah.
Sure. I'm Ken Toto. I'm the Deputy Director at ORR. And Kathleen, certainly appreciate you convening this panel, and certainly Kind and the Women's Commission for looking at this really very important issue. I think, certainly, as everyone said, it's been a very, very challenging year. We project a certain level of capacity and support and services for fiscal year based on what has been a very, very steady historical pattern of about 8,000 kids per year. And so when we started to kind of see this elevate and really double, for us to bring on capacity and services, it doesn't just happen overnight. Our providers are licensed shelter care providers. They have to staff, they have to get background checks, they have to locate and identify facilities. And so it was difficult. I mean, we finally hit, I think, the plateau, and we've sort of planned out, and I guess we're approaching what is now our new normal, which is probably looking to be about 14,000 placements or referrals from DHS this year. And so we're anticipating, I don't think that's going to change for next year, and so we're moving forward with the level of capacity that we have built in the past few months. Given sort of this situation, and certainly as the panelists mentioned, Border Patrol is not equipped to house these kids for any period of time. They're very, very short on resources and the ability to house children in the facilities themselves. Border Patrol stations are not set up for minors. So ORR did everything we physically could to really try to get those kids out of that situation. And we know that certainly the reception or surge sites weren't ideal, but we knew that we had to get them out of the Border Patrol stations. And sure, they were gyms and they were on cots, and they probably looked very much like what you'd see as a shelter after a hurricane. And really the provider that provided those services actually do emergency response in regard to any hurricane, certainly in the state of Texas where most of our shelters were. But our goal was to keep them there or have them there for a very, very short period of time and then transport them to our long-term shelters. And we really, really worked very hard to do that, and I'm so glad we're sort of past that phase, and we've got now permanent shelters up, and sort of we're moving forward. But I think, as Wendy mentioned, we're at a really important juncture of this program. When you go from 8,000 to 13,000, 14,000, it's a significant change in resources and staffing and providers and legal service providers, and what does that mean for sort of all the other services that the minors will encompass and their stay in the U.S. And it's really had us look very hard so far at our overall service component and even the resources that it takes to do that. And we're realizing that for us to run this program, we have to work together to really make sure it's the most effective, ensures the child's best interest, but you also have to look at that and the appropriation that we have and to work with that. And the only way we can make this work is to move the kids really through the system more effectively, more cost effectively, and at the same time trying to balance their best interest while they're here. And so we see this as very much sort of a collaborative effort. We appreciate your comments. I think in many ways we're moving forward on many of the recommendations that were mentioned, and certainly we feel very good about the partnership we've had with DHS over the past few months. I think some of the collaboration there has worked to minimize what could have been an even more challenging situation. We appreciate their collaboration certainly over the past few months as well. But we're definitely at a very, very important juncture. We're looking, I think, overall at the model to make sure that we can kind of approach the future given our new reality. So.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Ken. Let me now invite your questions and comments, and I'd like to ask you to please identify yourself when you speak up. If you'd wait just 1 second for the microphone so people offline can hear you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm Peggy Orchowski. I'm a reporter, as you can tell by my nosy question, but I'm with the Hispanic Outlook on Higher Education. And I didn't quite get your OR, that's Office of Refugees,
Resettlement.
and that's out of what?
HHS.
That's out of HS.
Health,
Okay,
Health and
okay.
Human Services.
It's helpful to get this. I have so many questions, but one of them I wanted to ask Ms. Jones. Obviously, this age group, you said average 14, so you're getting a lot of teenagers. What are they saying their expectations were on coming to the States, and what did they expect would happen to them? Do they know they're here illegally? Can they prove they're under 18? That's another thing. When you release them to family members, are they truly family members? And what I'm really curious about is this surge seems to correlate very closely with the whole hype about the prosecutorial discretion and the DREAM Act, which, and one of the criticisms of the DREAM Act is that it's going to encourage the illegal immigration of youth, and this seems to be a sample of it. So what do you think about that?
Thank you very much for those questions, Peggy. And I think
I'll step in for one piece of it, if that's okay. On the deferred action and DREAM piece, I think it's really, really important to make clear that there actually is no association. This surge, there's no association because the numbers of children coming across started way before there was any discussion about any DREAM Act announcement or deferred action by the administration.
You said it started in 2011, and that's when prosecutorial discretion.
Well, let me address first the DREAM Act piece. Okay, so the deferred action happened way before, and I should make it very clear that this population would in no way qualify for any benefit under that announcement.
Is that right?
So, no, because you have to be here for 5 years. You have to have been here for 5 years. So automatically, they don't qualify in any way. And as I said, the numbers of children coming across started at least 9 months, if not more, before that announcement was made. And regarding prosecutorial discretion, it's actually also a very different category of people who qualify. So again, these kids most likely do not qualify in any way, as far as I can tell, for prosecutorial discretion, certainly not in any disproportionate way. So I don't know if we have numbers. Actually, we should probably look at that. But or maybe DHS has something. I don't know if there's anybody here from the policy. Kelly's not here.
no, unfortunately, she is ill. She was planning to, Kelly Ryan from DHS.
Because again, that sector, the prosecutorial discretion, is really geared towards the adult population with criminal backgrounds, right? Or non-criminal. It's a category of people that they're looking at, and I don't think that they've actually reviewed the juvenile cases at all. Do you know about that?
Unaccompanied children as a category are not defined in the prosecutorial discretion policy.
one of them.
We have a
And
handful
age
of
is not a
kids.
factor either.
We have a handful of kids who've been granted PD, but it's very few. I'm guessing it's under 20 for sure. Out of right now we're working with about 3,800 kids. We're working with about 3,800 kids, and I'd say the number of kids who've gotten PD is probably under 20. So it's not. I think it's a stretch to say that that's a draw factor for these kids.
Yeah, and the last thing I would say is that if you look, and I think this is really significant, the numbers of adults apprehended coming across the southern border has dropped in that time frame, while the children go up. So it wouldn't make sense. Anyway.
And I think more to the point, I think perhaps is some of what Jessica was talking about, the push factors
Right.
being much more dominant in this in these findings than any pull, right?
Right. And as far as your question about their expectations, that's actually a sort of a difficult question to answer. I think a lot of the children have sort of a naive expectation that once they arrive to the U.S., they'll somehow get around the border and escape Border Patrol and get into the U.S., and then somehow they'll be able to get a work permit, and they'll start working, and they're going to go to school. And so they have very, I think, naive expectations about what will actually happen to them. And as far as if they are ever caught, the majority of them have no idea that they'll end up with ORR. None of them know that. And then once they're there, none of them know that there's even a possibility. The majority don't know there's a possibility that they could be released. So this is all something that they actually learn once they're in custody with ORR, and they start having family communication, and then they work with a case manager to see about if there are any sort of family resources. And ORR does have a pretty good screening process to try to evaluate whether these family members are actually family members. And then they also do age determination, which is another separate process, but they try to do sort of a holistic look about looking at their birth certificate. They contact consulates, and then they do other sort of like medical testing as well. But does that answer all of your questions? Okay.
Thank you. We have a
Yes, thank you. I'm a reporter with the National Journal. My name is Rosa. I'm curious to know, I know you said that the majority of the youth who are coming are from Mexico. I'm wondering if you've seen trends of other countries as well. And a second question is, for the kids coming from Honduras, have any of them said that, you know, the coup in 2009 had anything to do with it?
Yeah, so the majority are coming from Mexico. I think it's, actually, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I can actually get those numbers to you if you're interested. But the majority of those unaccompanied Mexican minors will actually be repatriated to Mexico. So there's very few that are actually entering into ORR custody.
Just to clarify, they actually never get into the country. Does that help?
Yeah, they get returned, and it's the Mexican kids, yeah, and then someone from their child welfare agency, DEEF, is supposed to meet them, and then they enter into the Mexican child welfare system until they can be reunified with their families locally.
And just to add again on that, those numbers have not gone up, to my knowledge.
They've only slightly increased, but yeah, pretty much it's the same amount of Mexican minors have been coming since the past couple of years, more or less. The real increase is actually with El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala, and that's where you see significant apprehension rates by Border Patrol, and that also correlates with DCS's numbers as well. And as far as when we interviewed youth about sort of what was happening in their own home countries, a lot of them couldn't actually point to any sort of real political event. Not many of them were, I think, that sophisticated as far as pointing to concrete political events. A lot of these kids are really impoverished. They don't have a lot of education. And they talked more about gang violence than anything else.
Gang violence.
Yeah, some of the youth talked about how they slowly started seeing people disappear in their communities, and they didn't want to be the next person. So, yeah.
In our work in Guatemala, our NGO partners, what they've told us also reflects what Jessica just reported, in that they've said that the gang violence has increased, narco-trafficking is increasing, and they also pointed to food insecurity issues resulting from crop failures last year. And a lot of the kids we work with come from very rural, agrarian communities.
And I would just add, and I know that many of the people in this room probably already know this, and Jessica alluded to it, but I think very often with children's, when you're working with children and talking about what the causes of their insecure situation is, they're just not aware of things at that level. And and I can tell you that this goes across the board, not just when you're talking about asylum claims or about why they left and what caused it. I mean, they're much more aware of the immediate reason that they left and not what has caused, what steps led to that. And that's pretty common. It's pretty hard to get them to understand that.
We have 2 questions up here, 3 questions up here, so.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rabia Alhaj. I had a couple questions. I think, Wendy, you mentioned the forced gang recruitment, and I wanted to hear more about whether or not the people that, I know that you guys are separate entities, but I know that you had interviewed, and there was interviewed the children, and there was general discussion of generalized violence, but are they leaving because of the generalized violence, or are they leaving because they were targeted in terms of recruitment? And the reason why I ask is because it matters for asylum purposes whether they were, generalized violence isn't going to help you for an asylum claim, but if you can provide something more specific, even then it's very hard to, that's not really grounds for asylum unless you can show something else. And another question I had about the partnership with Guatemala, the NGOs in Guatemala, I was very interested to hear more about that and how many years that's been in place and how does that work? And are we looking to, or are you guys, not me, but are you guys looking to see if that's going to work in other countries? The fact that you guys only had 4, how many people went through the program? And I know you said only 4 returned, but 4 out of
80 currently.
I mean, that's a huge number.
Statistically, it's a pretty good result.
Yes, I'd be interested to hear more about that initiative.
Thanks. Would you, let's take 2 or 3 questions and then come back to the panel, so please go ahead.
I'm with Catholic Legal Immigration Network, and I work with the data and evaluation component of the legal orientation program for custodians that Wendy mentioned. And so I've been able to see directly the impact that that program has been having, and it kind of speaks to your comment about clustering of services. And so what that program has done, it's implemented at a number of sites around the country that are very close to immigration courts. And so what we've seen in the data is that it's been good at reaching the UAC that have been released from ORR custody within the region of that site. And so we've seen some real significance in that, and also in the impact of reducing in absentia rates for the children whose custodians have gone through the program, and then increasing the legal representation as well. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about your thoughts on clustering of services and what is continuing to be done in the future for that.
Okay, thanks. And could we get this question too? Thank you.
Thank you. Carolina Jimenez from the Open Society Foundations. Wendy, you mentioned that you see the need for a regional approach, and I cannot agree more. But you focus more on the countries of origin, considering that that's where they live from. But then you mentioned the levels of violence that you usually see these kids have suffered during transit. Mm-hmm. And of course, one thinks about the responsibility of Mexico in this case as a transit country where most of these crimes occur, and we all know that the level of impunity is very high. I believe the work of most of you is centered around what happens to the child once the child enters the system in the U.S., but the big question is there something that could be done so these kids have the opportunity to access justice about what happened to them during the transit?
It's great questions all. Okay, why don't you start?
I'm not sure where we're going, but the question about the gang asylum claims, and the answer is the claims we see range from, very specific targeted violence at that particular child in terms of recruitment, and then the child fleeing that recruitment, to more just, what's happening in the community. But we do see an overwhelming number of kids who've been very much targeted for that recruitment and are trying to escape it. And you're right, those claims are very difficult to present and win, but we have won some of them. And I think that's an issue that needs to be looked at in more depth in the asylum system, is where do those claims fit in the definition. The question about the Guatemala project, we launched it as a pilot in Guatemala because not much had been done to date in terms of trying to do these return and reintegration efforts. So we're right now in the phase where we've started the monitoring and evaluation component of the project to identify what were best practices, what worked, what didn't work. But our ultimate goal is, yes, to expand into other sending countries and to sustain what we're doing in Guatemala, hopefully at a larger scale so that we can help more kids. I think we've learned a lot along the way. One of the things I think that has proven very successful is working with the child before they actually even go back, so that the return is seamless as it possibly can be, so that we can really gather information about the child, what their needs are, what their expectations are, who is their family, can they go back to that family, do they want to re-enroll in school, what is it that they need and desire in order to remain home. So we're very hopeful and expectant that the project will be built upon, both in Guatemala and in other countries. LOPC, one of the programs, we see this as kind of two sides of the same coin. These kids are released to family members, and very often the decisions that are being made in these children's lives, pre-release and post-release, are family decisions. These kids are not operating in isolation, so reaching that sponsor, that custodian, and informing them this is the process the child's in, this is why it's important that the child have a child advocate, a lawyer, whatever they need to get through the process. It's really, it's part of a safety net for these children, and what we find is the more information they have about the process, the more likely they are going to stay in the process and reach some kind of conclusion. And, going to the point I think Natalie was making, there are some kids who return home is the best solution, but how are we going to figure that out unless we really provide those kind of services to find out what's going on in that child's life? Again, if kind of building on what Ken said, I think we are in a new norm where we will see these kids moving through the system more rapidly. So we need to ensure that the safety net is, again, reaching them at that next point where we know we're probably likely to see those kids, which is their first master calendar hearing in the immigration court. And I do think there's some interest in exploring that idea, at least on a pilot basis, and certainly we're encouraging that. Your question on transit countries, I'm straying a little bit beyond what we do. I don't know if you have more to say on that than I do, but certainly I would reinforce that you're right. The transit countries also have a responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, as you know. And I think, some of the things that we've been doing is to try to work more closely with Mexican NGOs who are working with migrants, to just try to kind of see where things are happening and how, and come up with solutions together as a transnational coalition, as opposed to each country kind of trying to figure out what's happening within their own borders. And I think that that's important, and there's a long way to go on it. There are some groups who've been working on Mexican issues and what happens with migrants crossing, as you well know. And I think that actually this also feeds in a little bit to what Natalie mentioned, and another project that we have at the Women's Commission regarding family and parental rights, because I think not all of these, we do have this, and there's a lot of movement, and it's all interconnected between families who are partially on one side of the border, partially on another, and who have to cross. And I think things like home assessments, or working with not just the immigration authorities of each country, but also with the social service agencies, child welfare, and other groups who are working with these children and with their families is really important. We have to find a way to connect them all. But it's a challenge because it crosses many disciplines and then also involves foreign affairs.
Kevin, please.
U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. This question is more to Ken. Sorry. So in terms, Michelle mentioned the appropriations process. Has there been discussions within OR about future planning? If this is the new norm and we're anticipating 14 to 16,000 kids a year, what's been the discussions about budget planning for future years? And have you tried to ask for more funds in next year's budget, which just hit in the House? It's something that some of the NGOs are concerned about because, you know, you're paying Peter, you know, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. So, if you could respond.
Thanks, Kevin. I think I think there's a lot of factors really at play right now. Obviously, I think many know that our refugee arrivals were looking lower this year, so we ended up using some of the refugee program money to help support the UAC program during influx. And we're actually having to kind of split fund some of our other programs to continue supporting the UAC program. We're obviously looking at a higher number for the UAC program for 13. I really can't go into a lot of detail yet because it's still a lot of discussion in the department before we go forward. But obviously it has impact. And I think that's part of our look at overall how do we really look to make the program more effective, not only service-wise, but also cost-effective. We know that the shorter period, certainly that the kids are with us, that there's considerable cost savings in it. So we're looking at all factors that could potentially impact the budget. So there's a lot of discussion at all levels, believe me. So.
Can I just add to that? I mean, one thing that we haven't talked about, I think when we're talking about this issue, it's inherently unpredictable. We don't know how many kids are going to come each year. And on top of that, this really isn't an immigration issue. It's closer, in my mind, to a refugee issue. This is an extremely vulnerable population. And they have, you know, tremendous needs as they come across our border. So my staff sometimes accuse me of having too many ideas, but one of the things I think we need to look at in the long run is something like an IRMA account, the Emergency Refugee Migration Assistance Account, a slush fund that we can tap into to match the needs as they occur, and a development of a contingency plan because, you know, really hats off to ORR how quickly they responded and they were able to move out of that triage mode into a more permanent situation. But it could happen again. We could go from 15,000 to 20,000. We just don't know. So it would be nice to have some resources we could tap into as we go.
No.
Please
Thank
don't
you.
say 20,000.
Well,
I'm not wishing for that either.
But be prepared is the Boy Scout creed. You know, you never know what may happen. There was one question. I think we have time for one more, and then I want to give our panelists and our special guests a chance to make a final comment.
Thank you. My name is Wendy Haragi, and I wanted to know from a legal perspective, which immigration benefits are you most seeking out when you do an intake and when you do take on these cases, and which seem the most promising right now for the UAC population?
Mm-hmm. The most popular form of relief in our program is special immigrant juvenile status. And that's partly a result of changes under the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act that procedurally made that program much more accessible than it used to be. So we are seeing an increase in SIJ. But, you know, having said that, we have a good mix of asylum, T, some U as well.
From the CIS Ombudsman's Office, and I had a question just about the process overall that I've never understood. Is there any way that kids could get the services and get screened and go through some kind of administrative custody without notices to appear being issued? Has there been any discussion about that? It seems like the EOIR, the whole system is not set up to deal with kids, and they've done a lot to try to accommodate, but is there any way to get them out of that whole system and deal with it in some other fashion?
Two things. One is a proposal that's currently being discussed to see if it can be implemented is issuing a notice to appear when the child's apprehended, but not filing it until the child reaches their ultimate destination. From our perspective, that would be a good thing in that it saves administrative time, and frankly, for my staff, which is strapped right now, it changes us having to file changes of venue for these kids. Secondly, under the Trafficking Act, there was one change that was made that's kind of moving in the direction I think that you're indicating, which is initial jurisdiction of children's asylum claims was lodged with CIS, with the asylum court, as opposed to the immigration court. From my perspective, it hasn't been implemented as fully as it could have been, in that a child who's released to a parent is no longer deemed unaccompanied by CIS, so that jurisdiction, that initial jurisdiction, is denied. So the kid remains in immigration court, and we've seen, particularly in my Los Angeles office, this ping-ponging of kids back and forth between the court and the asylum court, which, when you're doing pro bono, is not a good thing, because the pro bono attorney is basically saying to us, you got me filling out these forms for the asylum court, now I'm being told I shouldn't be there, I should be back in immigration court, and it's kind of a drain on pro bono time, which is limited to begin with. So it's been imperfect, but it's a step in the direction I think you're talking about.
Okay, thanks. Sure.
Hi, I'm Aline Matushak. I'm a colleague of Mr. Ken Toda with the Office of Refugee Resettlement. I'm actually also a licensed social worker, an MSW, and bilingual as well. And I also had the opportunity to travel to our surge facilities while we were during the influx period. And I appreciate that a lot of this conversation is focused on moving forward, recognizing that these surge facilities are now closed, and I agree with that being the focus of our conversations. However, we are all, I think, continuing to work with children that came out of the surge facilities, be it through post-release providers or the legal service providers. So again, even though those centers have closed, those children are still out there. So I think it's important to have a same and a shared understanding of the services that the children did receive while they were in our care, because that certainly helps inform the services that the children should be receiving now. So I just wanted to mention that the surge facilities were actually operated by licensed care providers. So we did not contract directly with the YMCA or a gym or that type of thing. We work directly with our regular licensed care providers who've been providing services to UAC for many years. So the children physically stayed at another location, but they were run by the non-governmental child welfare, expert organizations that we do work with, and the children actually received a full range of services while in this program. I met with the kids while I was down in San Antonio, and you met with them, spoke with them in Spanish about their experiences, their perceptions, how they spent their day, and the children actually reported very positive experiences, stating that most of their day was actually spent in school, doing classroom type of activities. I think that children always have an interest and a need for as much information as possible about their case and where their case is going, which we understand and appreciate. And a lot of those questions are certainly always going to be around legal. I'm happy to say that we did work with the Vera Institute of Justice to develop a legal resources guide for children coming out of the search facilities, and had a legal resource guide for the children in the San Antonio area and a separate one for the children coming out of Harlingen. So a lot of those children coming out of those should have received that, in addition to Know Your Rights DVD presentations and handouts. So some of the children, when you're working with them, now that they've been released, probably have some of this information. So I think that's helpful to know moving forward and serving them now post-release. So thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to comment on that,
yeah,
Jessica, how that comports with your observations?
Yeah, thank you, Eileen, for clarifying. Yeah, they were run by licensed care providers, child welfare care providers, but the facilities were just short-term licensed contracts for emergency care. And some of the kids that were in surge facilities that were at gyms were typically already licensed shelters through ORR, and so they transformed the gyms into sort of this short-term emergency sort of shelter to deal with the influx. And the primary goal was actually to move these kids out of CBP so they weren't staying in these holding cells, which Kathleen sort of described. They were windowless holding cells. These kids were taking turns sleeping on the ground for
Yeah,
this is CBP. Yeah, just to clarify, those conditions are CBP, holding cells, yes, with CBP.
CBP is Customs and Border
Protection.
Oh,
Yeah. So these are with Border Patrol, the holding stations. So Eileen, I think, was right to clarify that point. And they were definitely getting at least 4 hours a day of school. And then they had depending on where they were, they had Know Your Rights presentations, and I think it did take a while to sort of get Know Your Rights presentations down on the ground, and there were still significant gaps, I think, with some of the surge facilities that didn't actually get legal service providers into their facilities, and that was just a big resource issue. And then there were some concerns as far as just OR staff and the facility staff was forced to deal with double the amount of kids, and so a lot of the kids didn't actually get the case management or the individual or group counseling that they normally would have gotten if they were in a regular OR program. Yeah. But then we also recognize that's a resource problem.
A resource problem and a question of the system just being overwhelmed in a particular time frame. I'm sorry to say that we are out of time, and I'd like to give just each of you, a very, very quick last word, and if Ken or Natalie would like a quick last word too, I would give that to them, but we'll have to be very brief. Wendy?
Well, I would just say that this is exactly the kind of conversations we need to be having. We need to brainstorm, how do we do this better? I think that we've met a tremendous challenge, and with challenge comes an opportunity too. So sometimes I feel like a sense of deja vu that many of the things we've been talking about for years are now resurfacing as ideas as we look at this increased number of kids coming in. And I just thank you, MPI, for hosting this, and I hope we can keep the conversation going.
Well, I think it was when I was chair of the Women's Commission that I went on a trip to California with you to look at unaccompanied minors in detention. So, these certainly are not issues that are going to go away anytime soon. But as Ken indicated, I think we are at sort of a point of inflection, certainly, in this whole issue. And I am pretty sure we will be having another briefing on this topic before very long to try to go deeper into some of the issues and to perhaps pick up on the social services as well as go deeper into the legal services. Michelle?
Yeah, I don't know that I pretty much feel the same way as Wendy. I think that this is an opportunity to really learn from a lot of the kind of issues that we had to face during the crisis, because as we've said a number of times, you never know. There could be another increase. You never know what's going to happen. So I think it's good to take the best practices that were developed during this process and take them to that next level. And I would say again that when we did the Halfway Home report about 4 years ago, we were really looking at kind of what had happened since the original transfer of children from INS to Health and Human Services to ORR, and how that had, succeeded, what improvements had been made, and what still had to happen. And I think, now this is this next stage, and it's a real opportunity to look at the system that was created really for a much smaller group of children that has come a really long way in developing, but that probably needs to be looked at much more holistically in terms of what we do now, that we have twice as many kids, we have some changes in culture that have evolved since that time. It's a good time to really make some fundamental improvements, I think.
Yeah, just good.
Yeah. Does that do it for you?
Yeah, that does it for me.
Ken or Natalie, would you like to?
Just to reiterate, I think looking at from the family concept, I think it's valuable looking at that from when they're
in ORR custody, how we're preparing for them to go to family. When they're in family, how can we support that family unit so it doesn't break down, so they're not back in being in an unaccompanied situation. And then finally, I would say I think it's time for us to look at the long-term outcomes for all these children that are released to our country, the legal and the social service, child welfare, child well-being. What's happening to this population? Because if we don't look at it, we're not going to know really how to improve. We're just kind of guessing.
very good point. Ken, any?
Sure. Just want to concur, I think, with the panelists, and do want to mention, I think that certainly this past summer has maybe brought what was kind of a very small, under-the-radar program very much to the forefront. So I think there's a lot of interest at all levels of government, and it does go to the White House. We've had great collaboration with DHS, and certainly moving forward, I think it's going to take all of that level of collaboration, and certainly from the NGOs as well, to kind of look forward and so really to build a model that really works best for the number of kids we're serving. So thank you for the discussion today.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you too. Thank our panelists and the audience for this excellent discussion. My last thought on this is, and going back to 1989, 1990, is really the importance of attention to and advocacy around these issues, because we know ORR needs more resources. We know the administrative action can be very effective in cases like this, so we really need to keep our eyes on this ball, and I thank you all for your interest and participation in that. So thank you to our panelists.